cabin, the welcome, and the storm, they say new beginnings are filled with hope. For me, it was more than that. It was salvation. After years of enduring a dead-end job, a draining divorce, and a city that seemed to suck the life out of me with every passing traffic jam, I made a decision that terrified everyone I knew. I sold everything. The apartment, the furniture, the stocks, everything. And I bought a modest, weather-beaten cabin on a couple of acres nestled deep in the Blue Ridge Mountains. The photos online made it look quaint. The reality? It needed work. A lot of it. But it was mine. All mine. Or so I thought. The dream. That started it all. I'd always dreamed of living off-grid. Not completely off the grid. I'm not a hermit. But enough to grow my own food, breathe air not laced with exhaust fumes, and maybe, just maybe, rediscover what peace felt like. So when I found the listing, a secluded cabin with solar panels, a private well, and backing onto hundreds of acres of undeveloped forest, I pounced. No noisy neighbors. No sirens. No HOA. That's what the realtor said. No HOA? I'd asked twice, skeptically. Not officially, she replied. There's a community association about 3 miles away, but you're out of their jurisdiction. They have no legal claim on this parcel. That was all I needed to hear. I closed within 30 days and arrived with nothing but my dog Bandit, a refurbished pickup truck, and the kind of wide-eyed optimism that city folks usually lose by 30. Peace at last. The first week was magical. Cold, crisp air that filled my lungs like fire. Bandit chased rabbits in the underbrush, and I hauled old logs from the shed to start a fire at night. The nights were still and dark, with stars stretching endlessly above. I met exactly one person, Old Man Roy, who ran the feed store in town. He wore flannel, smelled of pipe smoke, and gave me the best advice I'd get all month. "Watch out for the HOA folks," he said, tapping his temple. "They got ideas about what belongs to them, even when it don't." I chuckled. "They don't have jurisdiction over my place." He didn't laugh back. "Son, they don't need it. Just a reason." The knock at the door, it happened on the 8th morning. I had just brewed my first cup of coffee, Bandit lying at my feet, when I heard the knock. Not a gentle rap, but a rapid staccato pounding that made me spill hot coffee on my hand. I opened the door and stared into the face of a woman who looked like she'd been carved out of ice. "Name?" she barked. I blinked. Jack Ridley. Can I help?" "You're the one who just bought the Simmons property?" "Yes." She didn't introduce herself, but the man beside her held a clipboard and wore a smug expression. There was a third man, too, standing slightly behind, arms crossed, aviators reflecting the morning sun. "I'm Janet Claridge," she said, "president of the Ridgepine Homeowners Association. You're in violation." I actually laughed. "Excuse me? You have illegally constructed fencing along parcel 39B, which is Ridgepine's property," she said, as though she were explaining a parking ticket. "And your woodpile extends into a common-use buffer zone." I frowned. "There's no HOA here. I confirmed it." She didn't blink. "That may have been what your realtor told you, but Ridgepine has recently extended its community bounds to include all neighboring parcels within a 5-mile radius, per our new charter. You are subject to our rules and regulations." I crossed my arms. "You can't just decide that." "That's not up to you," she snapped. "You'll receive a notice in the mail. Until then, we're advising you to remove your fence, submit an exterior compliance form, and pay the backdated community fee. My $200 for this quarter." I laughed again. "No." Her face turned several shades darker. "You'll regret this," she said, turning on her heel. The clipboard guy tossed a thick envelope onto my porch as they left. Bandit growled. "Smart dog." The research I spent the next 48 hours doing deep research. I wasn't about to let a couple of clipboard-toting suburbanites bully me off land I owned outright. I pulled property records, the Ridge Pine HOA charter, and legal filings. I even contacted the county office. What I found made my stomach churn. Apparently, Ridge Pine HOA had filed a community expansion declaration 3 weeks before I moved in which they claimed stewardship over several undeveloped parcels for ecological preservation and security purposes. It was filled with vague language and legalese, but the intent was clear. They were laying claim to my land without ever owning it. But here's the kicker. It had no legal backing. None. They filed it like it was a neighborhood newsletter, not a binding legal change. No signatures from affected property owners, no approval from the county, and yet they were acting like they owned me. The next move, I called a local real estate attorney, Miss Carla Henderson, who agreed to meet me at her office the next morning. "Jack, this isn't the first time Ridge Pine HOA has tried this," she said, shaking her head. "They've pulled similar stunts with other isolated properties, but you're lucky. Yours is still free and clear, and they have no legal right to enforce anything on you." "So what do I do?" I asked. "Well, we can send a cease and desist, and I'll help you file a formal complaint with the county zoning board. That usually shuts them up." "What if they don't shut up?" she smiled. "Then we sue, and Ridge Pine hates court." I walked out of her office feeling 10 feet tall. The retaliation begins. I didn't have to wait long for them to escalate. That weekend, I came back from town to find orange construction flags all along my east property line. A wooden sign had been hammered into the ground. "Future Ridge Pine Nature Trail. No trespassing." They were trying to mark my land as part of a community trail system. I wasn't even mad. I was impressed by the audacity, but I also knew this was war. I took photos of the markers, the sign, and the tire tracks near my driveway. I called Carla, who told me to document everything and avoid confrontation. But confrontation found me. The confrontation. 3 days later, I woke up to shouting. Bandit was already at the door, barking his head off. I threw on a jacket, grabbed my phone, and stepped outside. There were 6 people in reflective vests, one of whom was wielding a chainsaw near my pine trees. "What the hell are you doing?" I demanded. One of them, a lanky man with a patchy beard, stepped forward. "Community clearing day," he said, as though that made perfect sense. "We're trimming back brush for trail safety." "On my land?" he shrugged. "HOA directive." I held up my phone and started filming. "You have 5 seconds to leave before I call the sheriff." They didn't move, so I dialed. By the time the sheriff arrived, the chainsaw had mysteriously vanished, but I had video proof. Sheriff Hayes was a local. He knew the HOA. He also knew Roy, who had apparently called in to vouch for me. "Jack, you have every right to press trespassing charges," the sheriff said. "I want them gone. I want them fined." "We'll start with a warning," he said. "But if they show up again, I want them buried," I muttered. He nodded, and then something surprising happened. The landlord revelation. I went into town a few days later to pick up more building supplies, and when I returned, there was a car in my driveway, an older model, Lincoln. Out stepped a man in his 60s, wearing a suede jacket and a weathered smile. "Mr. Ridley?" he asked. "Yeah?" "I'm John Caleb. I used to own your cabin. Sold it to the Simmonses 10 years ago. Heard about your HOA problem. Thought I'd drop by." We shook hands. He glanced at the trees, the mountains beyond. "This land, it's special, and it has a secret." "A secret?" He nodded. "You don't just own this cabin, Jack. You own the access rights to the spring and utility easement that Ridge Pine relies on. It's buried in your deed. They've been leeching off it for years." My eyes widened. "And they don't know?" "Oh, they know. But they hoped you didn't." That changed everything. The secret that broke the hoe when John Caleb left my property that afternoon, I sat on the porch for nearly 2 hours, trying to wrap my head around the bombshell he had dropped. The spring, the utility easement. All this time, the Ridgepine HOA had been siphoning water and underground power access through a utility line that crossed my land. A fact I hadn't realized because it had been tucked away in the fine print of a land deed written in legalese from 2 decades ago. John had brought a copy with him, and together we compared it to my purchase documents. Sure enough, clear as daylight in the easement clause, the property I now owned included not only the physical land beneath the cabin and trees, but also exclusive control of the only viable underground utility route and natural spring that Ridgepine had access to. In other words, they were trespassing, literally and legally. I didn't know whether to laugh or scream. For a week now, I'd been made to feel like I was the one on the back foot, the one fending off bureaucratic bullies who thought they could intimidate me into submission with fake fines, phony documents, and imaginary rules. But it turned out the very source of their community's water and utility stability ran straight beneath my boots. They needed me more than I could have ever imagined, and they were about to find out just how badly, but I didn't act impulsively. No, that would have been exactly what they expected. A blow-up, a confrontation, something that could be twisted against me in a courtroom or a community newsletter. Instead, I returned to Carla Henderson's office, this time with John Caleb, in tow, and laid everything on the table, literally. Carla scanned the deed, her fingers gliding slowly across the document as her eyes widened in recognition. "This changes everything," she whispered. "Jack, you have them in a chokehold, and they don't even know it yet." We spent the next 3 hours crafting a cease and desist order that would make a Wall Street lawyer proud. It cited the easement clause, demanded an immediate halt to all unauthorized usage of my land, including utility and water lines, and threatened a civil lawsuit if compliance wasn't immediate. More importantly, we prepared a registered notice to be delivered to every member of Ridgepine's HOA board, including Janet Claridge herself. I wasn't playing defense anymore. This time I was going on the offensive. The following Monday morning, while the sun was still warming the treetops and the dew clung to the long grass like crystal shards, I stood at my mailbox watching the courier's SUV vanish down the winding dirt road. Each envelope had been sealed, stamped, and tracked. Within hours, the Ridgepine board would know that the landowner they tried to bully had just pulled the rug out from under their entire operation. And then, silence. Not a knock on the door, not a flagged marker near my fence, not a passive-aggressive newsletter crammed into my mailbox. For the first time since I'd moved in, the HOA ghosted me. Days passed, then a week. It was almost eerie. No follow-up emails, no middle-aged foot soldiers with clipboards, just quiet. As if they were collectively holding their breath, hoping this problem would vanish on its own. But I knew better. The storm was coming. Sure enough, on the 9th day, Carla forwarded me an email she'd received from Ridgepine's legal representative, some overpriced firm out of the city with a reputation for burying small claims in paperwork until the opposing party gave up. The email contained vague accusations of easement misuse and community dependency negligence, and it even hinted that Ridgepine might seek emergency community arbitration. I had to read that last part twice. Arbitration? They wanted to drag me into some kind of HOA kangaroo court? Absolutely not. Carla's response was swift, brutal, and poetic. She referenced 3 state statutes, cited the original deed language, included photos of Ridgepine's unauthorized water lines, and, this was the cherry on top, attached a copy of a complaint she'd just filed with the county's zoning commission, accusing Ridgepine of utility theft and property encroachment. As she told me over the phone, "This isn't just about annoying you anymore. This is about fraud, Jack. They've been stealing your resources and intimidating you. And now we have proof. I thought that would be the end of it. I thought Ridgepine would retreat, issue some phony apology, maybe offer a quiet settlement to keep things under wraps. But I was wrong. What they did next made me realize that this HOA wasn't just entitled. They were desperate. And desperate people make dangerous decisions. 3 nights later, I was awakened by the shrill howl of Bandit barking furiously outside. My heart leapt to my throat as I grabbed a flashlight and raced to the front porch. Bandit was pacing near the edge of the woods, snarling into the darkness. At first I saw nothing, just swaying trees and moonlight, but then I caught it. A flicker of movement. The shadow of someone, maybe 2 people, retreating behind the tree line. I scanned the area with the flashlight, my pulse pounding in my ears, and found fresh boot prints in the soil. They led from the gravel road all the way to my utility box, the very box that controlled the water pump from the underground spring. I sprinted to it. The lock had been tampered with. Now it wasn't just intimidation. It was sabotage. I called the sheriff again, this time with video proof from my trail cams. I'd set them up after the nature trail incident, and the footage was as damning as it gets. 2 figures, both in hooded jackets, approaching my property under cover of darkness, attempting to tamper with the utility box. One of them even looked straight into the camera lens before realizing what it was. Sheriff Hayes took the report seriously. "They're escalating, Jack. This is criminal now. Trespassing, attempted property damage, possibly even intent to disrupt a public utility if that spring's connected to Ridgepine." "It is," I said. "And they know it." He shook his head. "Janet's in over her head. But she's the kind who won't back down until someone slaps her with real consequences." And that was exactly what I planned to do. The next day, Carla and I filed a motion for an emergency injunction. We were done playing games. The injunction demanded that Ridgepine HOA cease all unauthorized use of the spring and utilities, stay 500 feet away from my property lines, and publicly retract their claim that my land was under their jurisdiction. We didn't just want silence anymore. We wanted an apology. Within 72 hours, a court date was set. Ridgepine would be forced to show up in front of a judge and explain themselves. I had video evidence, historical deeds, utility records, and now the law on my side. But before that day arrived, something happened that shook me to my core and made this entire battle feel even more personal. On the eve of the hearing, I received an envelope in my mailbox, unmarked, no return address. Inside was a single sheet of paper. No letterhead, no signature, just a typed message. "You don't belong here. We'll take the land one way or another. You've been warned." I stared at the paper for a long time, trying to make sense of the threat. It wasn't just about bureaucracy anymore. This was vendetta-level madness. Someone in Ridgepine was willing to go beyond legal routes. They were willing to make it personal. And that was the final straw. I took the letter straight to Carla, who added it to our court file under intimidation evidence. Sheriff Hayes opened a separate investigation, and I sat in my cabin that night with Bandit curled at my feet, a rifle within reach, and the sinking feeling that this war wasn't just about property anymore. It was about power, pride, and the dark, twisted need for control that some people carry like a badge of honor. But what Ridgepine didn't understand, what Janet and her cronies had failed to realize, was that I wasn't just another transient. I wasn't a pushover city boy who would fold under pressure. I had been forged in the fires of chaos, divorce, job loss, betrayal, and come out stronger. This cabin wasn't just my retreat. It was my rebirth, and I was ready to defend it. The morning of the court hearing arrived with a quiet, misty chill that hung low in the mountain air. As I stepped out onto my porch, mug of black coffee in hand, the world around me felt eerily still. The birdsong was subdued, the trees unmoving, as if nature itself was holding its breath. Even Bandit, usually energetic at dawn, sat at my feet, his eyes alert and tail still. The night before had been long and sleepless, not because I feared the court itself. I'd faced harder battles in my life, but because I knew this hearing would finally lift the curtain and expose the true nature of Ridgepine and its leadership. This wasn't just a legal proceeding, it was an unveiling, a reckoning, and I intended to see it through to the end. I drove into the county courthouse with Carla riding shotgun, her briefcase overflowing with meticulously organized documents. Photographs, historical property records, copies of the utility easement, video stills from my trail cam footage, and the anonymous threat letter that still made my gut churn. Carla, usually composed and measured, was sharper than ever this morning. Her eyes gleamed with a fire I hadn't seen before, and I could tell she was more than ready to take this HOA to task. "Today," she said, glancing at me as we parked, "we don't just defend your rights. We put Ridgepine's entire operation under the microscope. If they lose today, they lose more than control, they lose credibility, and that's the only thing keeping their little empire afloat." As we walked into the courtroom, I immediately spotted the Ridgepine delegation seated on the opposite side. Janet Claridge sat dead center, flanked by two smug board members and a man in a crisp suit who looked like he had never once set foot in these mountains unless dragged by billable hours. She didn't look at me directly, but I could see her jaw tighten the moment I entered. That pleased me. She wasn't as calm as she pretended to be, not anymore. And the silence from Ridgepine over the past week? It hadn't been confidence. It had been dread. The judge entered, an older gentleman named Judge Martin Tolles, known in these parts for his intolerance of nonsense and his love of due process. He wasn't someone easily swayed by politics or influence, which made him the perfect man for this case. After reading through the opening documents, he raised his head and directed a pointed stare at Janet's lawyer. "Mr. Caldwell, let's begin with your claim. You are asserting that the HOA's expanded charter gives you regulatory authority over the defendant's property. Is that correct?" Caldwell stood, adjusting his tie with a show of confidence. "Yes, Your Honor." Ridgepine. HOA filed an expansion of jurisdiction through our internal charter amendments, which extended our governance to adjacent parcels for environmental and community cohesion purposes. Mr. Ridley's property, while technically outside our original bounds, falls within this extended perimeter, and Judge Tolles raised his hand. "And did you file these charter amendments with the county or receive approval from any municipal authority?" There was a pause. "Not at the time, no." "Then how do you presume to enforce them?" Caldwell hesitated. "Precedent, Your Honor. The HOA has historically operated—" "Mr. Caldwell," the judge interrupted again, voice like a gravel road under tire. "History does not make law. Proceed." Carla stood next, her tone firm, unwavering, and piercing in its clarity. She presented the easement clause, showing that my property not only sat outside Ridgepine's legal boundary, but also provided sole access to the underground utilities and natural spring the entire Ridgepine community depended on. Then she played the footage, the trespassers in the night, the chainsaw incident, and the threat letter. Every frame was a nail in the coffin, each one more damning than the last. But the real turning point came when she introduced a sworn affidavit from none other than John Caleb, the former owner of my land. His letter detailed how Ridgepine had, for years, used his spring and utility corridor under a gentleman's agreement, a handshake deal, never formalized, because their own infrastructure couldn't support their growing demands. That, unrecorded, arrangement had ended the moment he sold the property, making their continued use unlawful. The courtroom remained silent as the judge reviewed the exhibits. Janet looked pale now, her once arrogant posture shriveled into something tighter, more defensive. One of her board members leaned over to whisper something to her, and she shook her head almost violently, her lips pressed into a thin white line. The power dynamic had shifted. When Judge Tolles finally spoke again, his voice was thunder in a quiet canyon. This court finds that Ridgepine Homeowners Association has no legal authority over Mr. Ridley's property and has, in fact, engaged in multiple acts of unauthorized access, intimidation, and potential utility theft. Furthermore, the use of unofficial enforcement tactics, including trespassing and veiled threats, is reprehensible. I am granting Mr. Ridley's motion for an injunction effective immediately. There was no celebration, no cheering or fist-pumping, just a release. A long, collective exhale from the right side of the courtroom, as if all the tension that had coiled around my life since the moment I arrived at the cabin had finally broken apart. Carla nodded once, professionally, but I could see the grin behind her eyes. And me? I just stared straight ahead, feeling for the first time in weeks like I could finally breathe again. But the judge wasn't done. I'm also referring this matter to the county attorney for potential criminal investigation. Any further attempts by Ridgepine or its representatives to interfere with Mr. Ridley's property or utilities will be prosecuted under trespassing and harassment statutes. This court does not look kindly on abuse of authority cloaked under the guise of community governance. As the gavel dropped, Carla leaned over and whispered, "They're done, and they know it." We walked out of that courthouse into the warm light of a late afternoon sun that bathed the mountains in gold and amber. I could almost hear the trees breathing with me, like even the land itself had been waiting for justice to fall. Later that evening, back at the cabin, I sat on the porch with Bandit curled up next to me and a glass of bourbon in hand. The silence was no longer tense. It was earned, it was peaceful, and it was mine. That night, for the first time since I arrived, I slept with the windows open and the doors unlocked. Not out of carelessness, but because I knew the worst of the storm had passed. Ridgepine had lost not just a legal battle. They had lost control, leverage, and whatever inflated authority they believed gave them the right to trample over people like me. But even as I rested, a small voice in the back of my mind whispered a warning. People like Janet don't just disappear. They regroup, they re-strategize, and they come back with new masks, new tactics, and new schemes. So while the war might be over for now, the battle for the soul of this land, of independence, of principle, might only be entering its next phase. And if that's the case, well, I'm ready. The days that followed the court victory were blissfully quiet, almost unnaturally so. The kind of silence that feels earned, but not entirely trustworthy, like the eye of a hurricane, calm yet haunted by the knowledge that the storm still lingers just beyond the edge of the horizon. Life at the cabin settled into a kind of rhythm that had previously felt unattainable. Mornings with Bandit roaming the dewy forest trails, afternoons spent splitting wood, tending the small garden I'd started, and evenings where the only sounds were crickets and the occasional hoot of a distant owl. The courtroom win hadn't just protected my land, it had restored my dignity, validated my decision to escape the chaos of urban life and bet it all on a weathered patch of land nestled deep in the folds of the Blue Ridge. But the peace, however sweet, came laced with a subtle unease. Because people like Janet Claridge didn't take defeat well, they didn't bow out quietly. They regrouped in the shadows, reorganized, and returned with sharper claws. It began with whispers, small things. Word from the local feed store that Ridgepine had formed a community preservation subcommittee, a vaguely defined arm of the HOA designed, according to their new newsletter, to protect Ridgepine from external threats to its culture and natural resources. I nearly laughed when I read it, because though it didn't mention me by name, the implication couldn't have been more obvious. I was the external threat. The outsider who had embarrassed them in court shined a light on their backdoor dealings and held the keys to the spring and utility line they still so desperately needed. At first, I dismissed it as empty posturing, a performative gesture for the residents who still clung to the illusion that Ridgepine's leadership held any real power. But then things took a darker turn. One morning, I found tire tracks in my upper field, fresh ones that hadn't been there the day before. No reason for anyone to be up there unless they were surveilling the land. A few days later, I noticed one of the trail cams I'd left on the south edge of my property had gone offline. When I went to investigate, I found it smashed, ripped. Off its mount, the lens shattered. Bandit caught the scent of something and barked his head off, racing through the woods for nearly a quarter mile before doubling back, confused and agitated. I knew what it meant. Someone had been on my land. Again, no HOA patrol, no harmless misstep. This was targeted, deliberate. A silent reminder that though I'd won in the courtroom, the war for Ridgepine's pride was still far from over. Carla advised me to report every incident, and I did. Sheriff Hayes remained supportive, visiting the property himself to walk the perimeter, shake his head, and confirm what I already knew. They're not done. Janet's trying to find another angle, but she's skating on thin ice now. His department increased their patrols around the area, especially near the Ridgepine boundary, but the damage wasn't in what they could do. It was in the psychological warfare they had begun to wage. I started receiving mail that had clearly been opened and resealed. Packages went missing. A fake environmental surveyor knocked on my door one afternoon, clipboard in hand, asking strange questions about land runoff and septic drainage before I pressed him hard enough that he practically ran back to his Prius. Later that night, I reviewed my gate camera and saw the same man chatting casually with Janet Claridge in the Ridgepine parking lot. But the most disturbing escalation came a few weeks later, when I was contacted by the County Utility Commission. According to the message, someone from Ridgepine had submitted a request to relocate the existing utility line that serviced the HOA, citing imminent infrastructure risks and offering a proposed rerouting plan that bypassed my land entirely. At first, I assumed it was another desperate bluff. But the more I investigated, the more I realized they were serious. Ridgepine had hired a third-party engineering firm and started pushing through paperwork for a new, entirely unnecessary infrastructure project, claiming environmental hazards, flooding threats, and even hostile landowner behavior as justification for the rerouting. This wasn't just about water or pride anymore. This was sabotage cloaked in bureaucracy. If Ridgepine managed to get their petition approved, they wouldn't just cut off their dependency on my easement. They would try to discredit me in the process. If they could convince the commission I was hostile or unfit to steward the land, they could challenge my property rights again. Maybe even force the county to reclassify my parcel under some twisted interpretation of community stewardship. The very idea was absurd, but I'd seen enough by now to know not to underestimate Janet's willingness to twist reality in her favor. Carla doubled down. She filed counterclaims, launched an investigation into Ridgepine's proposed environmental report, and subpoenaed communications between Janet's board and the engineering firm. What we uncovered was damning. Emails, texts, and memos that revealed a coordinated effort not to preserve the environment, but to build a false narrative. One that painted me as a rogue, obstructionist landowner who was hoarding a vital resource and jeopardizing public health. One message sent by Janet herself read, "He might have won in court, but we'll drown him in filings until he begs to sell." I sat with that sentence for a long time, printed it, tacked it to my cabin wall as a reminder of the stakes. This wasn't just about pushing back anymore. It was about protecting everything I'd fought for, my land, my peace, and the life I'd started to build in the shadows of the ridge. Because if they succeeded in convincing the commission, it could set a precedent, not just for me, but for every landowner caught near the ever-creeping borders of an HOA that thought its charter superseded the Constitution. So I went to work, not just legally, but practically. I reinforced my fences, upgraded the surveillance system, installed real-time motion sensors along the property's blind spots, and started documenting every minute detail. But I didn't stop there. I reached out to local environmental groups, journalists, even a documentary filmmaker I'd met years ago during a community rights project. I shared the footage, the emails, the documents. I didn't beg for sympathy. I presented facts. And the story that emerged wasn't just about one stubborn HOA. It was about a systemic issue, about how people with no real legal power used intimidation, bureaucracy, and fear to bend others to their will. Within weeks, the story began to circulate. A local paper ran a front-page spread titled, "The Cabin versus the Cartel: How One Man Took on Ridgepine HOA." The response was explosive. County officials were flooded with calls, HOA residents began asking uncomfortable questions, and the quiet, manipulative grip Ridgepine had held for years started to loosen. Even some of their own members turned against the board, questioning Janet's judgment, ethics, and the enormous legal fees they were burning through in pursuit of what now looked like a personal vendetta. The board meetings grew tense. The whispers grew louder. And Janet, for all her authority and venom, began to show cracks. I could have stopped there, but I didn't. Because Ridgepine had tried to ruin me, and I wasn't just going to survive. I was going to expose them. If there's one thing I've learned from all this, it's that institutions don't fall from the outside. They rot from within. I used to think HOA boards were just paper pushers, overbearing, maybe arrogant, but not dangerous, not organized, not capable of systemic manipulation. But Ridgepine proved otherwise. They'd built a fortress of control, not just over lawns and fences, but over people's minds. And for years, that control went unchallenged. But every fortress has its cracks. All it takes is a little pressure in the right place for everything to start crumbling. And the pressure I was applying, legal, public, strategic, was starting to split Ridgepine right down the middle. The first real shift came not from the county commission, not from my lawyer, and not even from the media attention. It came from an email. An anonymous message sent to the inbox I'd set up for public communication during the HOA conflict. The subject line was simple: "You need to know the truth." I almost deleted it, assuming it was another troll or HOA plant trying to rattle me. But the message inside was short, direct, and packed with a kind of restrained fear that immediately felt real. It read, "I've been on the Ridgepine board for 5 years. I've watched Janet and her allies take this place from a neighborhood to a dictatorship. You're not crazy. You're not wrong. They've been lying to everyone, even us. If you're serious about fighting back, I'm ready to talk. But we have to meet in person. No phones, no recordings. This doesn't leave your cabin. Signed, M." That message hit me harder than I expected, not because I was surprised someone on the board wanted out. By now, I'd suspected some of them were getting uncomfortable, but because it meant the internal support structure Janet relied on was splintering. It meant someone had seen enough of her backdoor deals, her coercive tactics, her legal overreach, and decided they couldn't stomach it anymore. I read the message 3 times before I responded, keeping it cautious but open. "I'll listen." 1 time. "Your move." The next evening, just after dusk, a figure emerged from the edge of the woods beyond my southern field. Bandit perked up but didn't growl, which was a good sign. He could sense intent better than I could. I stepped outside with my jacket zipped to the neck and waited by the porch light as the figure approached. She kept her hood up until she was within a few feet, then pulled it down to reveal a face I recognized, not by name, but from the handful of HOA newsletters I'd studied. Her name, she confirmed, was Melissa Trent, treasurer of Ridgepine HOA. We sat in the cabin's living room, logs crackling in the fireplace, a pot of coffee steaming on the table between us. Her hands were shaky. At first, her eyes darting to the window as if expecting Janet to burst through it like a villain in a crime drama. But once she started talking, it all poured out. The misappropriation of funds, the secret board votes held without quorum, the pressure tactics used on elderly residents who dared to speak up. And then she said something that made my blood go cold. "Jack," she said, voice low and tired, "you were never the target. Not at first. Janet wanted your land because she thought she could flip it. She was planning to push through a zoning request to reclassify your parcel, then strong-arm you into selling. She even had a buyer lined up, a developer who wanted to build a luxury retreat on your property once the water rights were secured. That's why she kept pushing the trail system idea. It was a smokescreen, a PR cover for annexation. That single sentence changed the game for me. It wasn't just about community politics. It wasn't even about water anymore. It was about profit. Janet had seen a way to turn Ridgepine into more than a neighborhood. She saw an empire in the woods. My cabin, my spring, and my utility easement were just stepping stones to her legacy. She wanted to build a wellness resort, complete, with rental cabins, a yoga center, and a spa fed by my mountain spring. And every underhanded tactic she'd used, from false fines to trespassing, had been in service of that goal. Melissa continued, explaining that she'd gone along with it out of fear and loyalty at first. But as Janet's behavior grew more erratic and hostile, especially after our courtroom victory, cracks had begun to form. Some of the board members had started questioning Janet's authority, but every time someone raised a concern, they were either replaced, threatened, or silenced. The HOA had become less of a community board and more of a cult of personality. "I have documents," she said finally, reaching into her bag and pulling out a flash drive. "Board minutes, unauthorized financial transactions, private emails, between Janet and the developer. I kept copies. I was scared, but now I'm more scared of staying silent." I took the flash drive without hesitation, immediately understanding its value. This wasn't just proof. This was leverage. The kind that could end Janet's career, trigger legal consequences, and gut Ridgepine from the inside out. I promised Melissa anonymity unless she chose otherwise, and she left just as quietly as she came, slipping back into the woods like a ghost. That night I stayed up until nearly dawn, poring through the files on the drive. Everything she'd said was true, and worse. There were invoices doctored to hide expenses related to the resort project. There were emails between Janet and the county zoning official discussing expedited reclassification strategy, and most damning of all, there was a spreadsheet listing projected earnings from land that didn't belong to Ridgepine, including my property. I met with Carla the next morning, and her reaction was immediate. "This isn't a land dispute anymore. This is fraud, criminal fraud, conspiracy, zoning abuse, you name it. We have more than enough to bring this to the state attorney, but I didn't want to go to war behind closed doors again. Not this time. I wanted the truth to be public. So we made a decision, one that would take the entire Ridgepine community by storm. We scheduled a public meeting, an open forum, announced in the local newspaper and across social media, inviting every Ridgepine resident to attend. We didn't brand it as an exposé. We called it a Transparency and Land Rights Forum and held it at the community center, a building Ridgepine shared with neighboring neighborhoods that weren't under HOA rule. The turnout was massive. Dozens of residents, some skeptical, some angry, many confused, filled the chairs. I stood before them, nervous but resolute, with Carla by my side and a projector screen behind us. Over the course of an hour, we laid it all bare. The false filings, the surveillance, the court ruling, and then we showed the documents from Melissa, the emails, the transactions, the zoning conversations. There was no shouting. No chaos, just stunned silence. And then slowly, a murmur. Then outrage, and finally questions, real piercing questions. By the time the forum ended, Ridgepine had turned on itself. Janet didn't even show. Rumor had it she'd caught wind. of the event and fled town for a family emergency. But the damage was done. The board was fractured. A recall vote was scheduled. The county opened a formal investigation. And the developer? They pulled out completely, citing liability concerns. As for me, I returned to my cabin under a twilight sky, the trees once again whispering with peace. Bandit followed close. Behind, tail wagging, ears perked. There was no celebration, no victory speech, just a quiet, steady satisfaction that justice had finally pierced the veil. But I knew better than to believe it was truly over, because power doesn't die easily. In the days following the public forum, Ridgepine looked less like a well-manicured suburban utopia and more like a fractured company in freefall. Board members resigned under pressure. HOA meetings were suddenly attended by dozens of previously apathetic residents demanding explanations, and local media had latched onto the story like wolves who'd just caught the scent of scandal. Headlines ranged from HOA overreach sparks land rights uproar to mountain man brings down local powerhouse. But through it all, amid the fallout, resignations, and whistleblowing, there remained one conspicuous absence: Janet Claridge. She had disappeared entirely. Her email had autoresponders set up. Her house sat dark and empty. And when the sheriff's department attempted to formally serve her with notice regarding the upcoming fraud inquiry, she couldn't be found. Some said she'd gone to stay with family in Atlanta. Others whispered about her trying to sell off assets before indictments came down. But one thing was certain: Janet was silent. And in my experience, when people like her go silent, it's never about surrender. It's about strategy. That unsettling calm returned to the air, the kind that makes animals pace, makes seasoned folks keep their eyes on the tree line, and keeps your hand close to the lock on your door, even in daylight. I tried to lean into my usual routine, gardening, splitting logs, keeping Bandit's water bowl full, but the truth was, I hadn't slept soundly in weeks. My gut told me Janet had one more play, one final card to throw down before her house. Of cards collapsed for good. I found out just how right I was when I received a certified letter from the Office of Environmental Protection and Watershed Integrity. A government seal. A printed notice. A demand. According to the letter, an anonymous tipster had submitted a report alleging that I was contaminating the spring that fed into Ridgepine's water system, intentionally or through negligence. They claimed illegal dumping, unpermitted trenching, and possible chemical runoff. The office, citing emergency environmental protocols, was opening a formal review and possible enforcement action. Included in the letter was a scheduled inspection date, 5 days out, and a warning. Failure to comply may result in immediate injunction, fines, and potential seizure of assets related to the contamination site. I stood on the porch with that letter in hand for what felt like an hour, the words swimming and reshuffling in my head like a cruel puzzle. It was a last-ditch move so absurd, so audacious that for a second I almost laughed. Janet had failed to defeat me through legal channels. She'd failed to discredit me with the county, failed to buy me out, and failed to win the public. So, now she was trying to weaponize the state, using an anonymous environmental complaint to paint me as a hazard to public health. And worse, if she succeeded, the government could move in and treat my land as a contaminated site. Seize it, fence it off, bury me in fees and litigation until I had no choice but to give up. This wasn't desperation. This was brilliance born from obsession. I called Carla immediately, sent her the documents, and by midnight we were sitting at my cabin table, lights low, legal pads everywhere. She confirmed my fear. If the inspector found anything remotely non-compliant, the state could act without further notice. That's how environmental enforcement works. Precaution over proof. And even if I won in the end, the fight alone could drain me. I barely slept that night. But when I did, I dreamed of Janet, standing in the woods, dressed in pristine white, holding a judge's gavel like a weapon. Her face expressionless, her voice flat. "You don't belong here, Jack. We build here. You break." The next morning, I called John Caleb, the previous owner, and explained everything. He arrived within the hour, bringing two things I hadn't expected: a worn leather binder and a woman named Teresa, who introduced herself as a former environmental inspector, who had worked for the state for over a decade. She now consulted privately for rural property owners. When I asked how John knew her, he simply smiled and said, "Sometimes you've got to beat fire with fire." Teresa immediately began a pre-inspection audit, walking every foot of the property. She tested the soil, sampled the spring water, reviewed the old piping infrastructure, and studied the easement paths. By the end of the day, she looked at me with a raised brow and said, "Jack, this is one of the cleanest sites I've ever seen. Whoever made this complaint did it with no evidence. They were gambling on fear. But just being clean wasn't enough." Carla wanted a counterattack. She filed a preemptive request for the environmental report to be supervised by a neutral third-party observer, citing the suspicious origin of the complaint and Ridgepine's history of harassment. Teresa's credentials gave the request weight, and the agency agreed to conduct the inspection with full transparency. Still, I felt the pressure mounting. The night before the inspection, I stayed up cleaning the cabin, checking pipes, adjusting the camera angles, double-checking documentation. I felt like a man preparing not for judgment but for siege. Even Bandit seemed to sense it, his ears twitching at every distant rustle, his pacing circles near the edge of the porch tighter and more frequent than usual. And then, as I was locking the gate for the night, a vehicle approached, a dark sedan, city plates, tinted windows. It stopped just short of the gate. The driver didn't get out, didn't honk, just rolled the window down and stared. It was Janet. She didn't look defeated. She looked victorious, like someone who knew she'd rigged the next game before the first move was even made. She didn't say anything at first, just let the moment stretch, until finally her lips curled into a cold smile. "You've put on quite a show," she said, voice smooth as lacquer. "But you're still alone out here. One mistake, one violation, that's all it takes." I didn't respond. I didn't blink. I just stared back, unmoved. She continued, "You could have joined us, Jack. You could have been a partner. But instead you decided to become a problem." I stepped forward slowly, hands at my sides, and replied in the calmest voice I could muster. "You don't get to decide what happens on this land anymore. You never did. The only thing you're going to decide now is which lawyer's going to plead your case." Her smile faded. She drove off, and I knew that the next day, inspection day, would be the final battlefield. The morning of the inspection broke under an overcast sky that blanketed the mountains in muted gray. A heavy mist clung to the pine trees like a ghost that refused to lift, and even the birdsong seemed cautious. The land itself felt like it was waiting, holding its breath, bracing not just for the arrival of men with clipboards and soil kits, but for a moment of truth that would determine the fate of everything I had fought for. This wasn't just a property dispute anymore. It had become a symbol of something bigger. A fight against overreach, against corruption, against the kind of greed that wears a mask of governance. Ridgepine hadn't just tried to take my land. They tried to crush my will, to rewrite the law in the image of their ambition. But today, the land would speak for itself. By 8 o'clock, 3 official vehicles lined the dirt road at the foot of my property. Out stepped 2 state environmental officers, one tall and cautious, the other younger and eager to impress. And beside them, walking with quiet authority, was Teresa, the retired inspector John had brought in as my consultant. She carried a worn clipboard and a calm confidence that instantly outshined the others. Carla arrived moments later with a small satchel of documents, her expression unreadable but determined. The inspection was to be neutral, procedural, and factual, but Make no mistake, this was a trial in every sense of the word, and I had no illusions about what was at stake. As we made our way down the slope toward the spring, I explained every detail of the property. Where the easement ran, how the runoff was managed, where the filtration box sat just beneath the rise. I didn't embellish or dramatize. I let the work speak for itself. The reinforced drainage systems, the native plant buffers I'd added to preserve erosion, the absence of any chemical storage or synthetic fertilizers. This land was clean because I treated it with reverence. Because to me, it was never just an asset. It was a living thing. The officers took samples, recorded pH levels, reviewed historical use records, and checked every corner of the site. Teresa guided them, asked her own questions, pointed out the professional-grade water testing kit I'd installed last month. She was subtle but effective, leading the inspection without dominating it, letting facts paint the portrait instead of emotion. When they requested to inspect the pipe junction near the utility easement Ridgepine had once used, I provided the original blueprints and utility service records showing the termination point. And when they asked about the alleged dumping that the anonymous complaint referenced, I opened the storage shed, pulled back the tarp, and showed them the meticulously sealed waste barrels I used for organic composting, certified and documented, with municipal tags. There was no panic, no protest, just full transparency. And still, I could see the younger inspector's brow crease slightly with each passing moment. Not because he found anything wrong, but because he didn't. The complaint had painted me as reckless, negligent, and possibly malicious. But what stood before them was a man who had not only protected his land, but had exceeded the standards Ridgepine itself had long ignored. The contrast was damning, and even more so because it was silent. There was no need for accusation or defense. The evidence had turned the complaint into a joke. By the time the inspection ended, we all gathered near the cabin porch as the older officer packed up the samples for lab verification. He turned to me, offered a curt nod, and said, "Mr. Ridley, pending lab confirmation, which I don't expect to show any issues, we see no grounds for enforcement at this time. Your systems are clean, documented, and maintained above the minimum requirements. We'll close the complaint unless new information surfaces. Thank you for your cooperation." It was a formal statement. Dry, bureaucratic. But in it, I heard the sound of chains breaking. As they departed, I looked toward the far tree line where, just days ago, Janet had made her final veiled threat. There was no sign of her now, no dark sedan, no smug smile, just a trail of muddy tire tracks and silence. She had played her last card, and lost. Not just because I had the facts on my side, but because I had something she never could understand: integrity. Where she had schemed in boardrooms and hid behind subcommittees, I had built something real. I had chosen to live quietly, honestly, on land that demanded respect. And now that land had defended me in return. The final blow came a week later, when the county published its full investigative summary. The environmental report was clean. The inspector's notes were glowing. And attached to the report was a formal reprimand for Ridgepine HOA, citing them for filing a false complaint, misusing public agency time, and attempting to weaponize environmental law for personal gain. That same day, Janet Claridge was removed as HOA president by unanimous board vote. The position was handed to a quiet, middle-aged teacher named Malcolm Reeves, who had spoken out at the Transparency Forum. Within 2 weeks, Ridgepine's board had voted to dissolve the Preservation Subcommittee, cancel the resort proposal, and formally declare that my land, and any land outside their original charter, would never again fall under their jurisdiction. But the moment that stayed with me, etched into my memory like a carved name in a tree, was when Melissa, the whistleblower board member, showed up at my cabin with a peace offering. A bottle of cider, some fresh-baked bread, and a small, folded card. Inside, it simply read, "You gave people permission to say no again. Thank you." It wasn't a grand gesture. But it was everything, because that was the real victory, not the injunction, not the inspection, not even Janet's fall from her self-appointed throne. It was the restoration of something Ridgepine had stolen from its people, the power to resist, to question, to reclaim what mattered. I kept the card on the mantel beside the old deed, the original one John Caleb gave me, with the water rights and utility path in neat cursive ink. Bandit rested at my feet, watching the horizon as the sun finally dipped behind the trees. The land was quiet again, but this time it wasn't holding its breath. It was exhaling.